Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our third live office hour for the MOOC on environmental security and sustaining peace. I'm Carl Brook. I direct international programs at the Environmental Law Institute, and I'm here with Tony Andrews. Tony is a principal and co-founder at the Center for Responsible Mineral Development. He was the lead author for the study that informed Bernarda Elizalde's lecture on conceptual frameworks and conflict pathways in Chapter 9. Tony also has a great deal of multidisciplinary experience, has worked in government, academia, and industry, and is a leading resource in the field. Before we jump in to the lecture, I just wanted to let you know that we'll be answering a mix of questions. Some of these have been submitted by students in advance of today's office hour, and some we are receiving from you live. We'll do our best to get through all of them. If we don't, we encourage you to post your questions in the office hours and other discussion groups. Tony, before we dive into the questions, maybe you could say a little bit more about yourself and your work and how you got to where you are.
Okay, well, thanks for that. And I apologize for the delay on getting online. But I am a geologist by profession. Spent a significant part of the first phase of my career as an exploration geologist looking at mineral deposits. And then I joined a Canadian association in support of the mining industry. It was the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada. And I was CEO of that organization for 24 years. And during that time, the whole area of corporate social responsibility became very important. And I became a lead in the industry approaching that CSR, that whole complex area. And we developed a good practice online guidance for that. And that's when I became very interested in responsible mineral development. But now I am the principal and co-founder of the Center for Responsible Mineral Development. And we work with both governments in the governance and management of mineral resources, and also with companies, civil society organizations, and communities, all with the objective of responsible, sustainable mineral development.
Excellent. I think I'd like to dive in, starting first with a question that is addressing the conflict pathway model that was presented in your study. The person asks, the conflict pathway model emphasizes the importance of thinking about causes and drivers at various temporal and spatial scales, from global to local. How has thinking about a conflict process at the global scale been helpful to you in your experience? In urgent situations, is it always worth taking this step back?
Well, first of all, it's been a very useful research analytical tool because, and this model, or this analytical framework as we call it now, evolved organically through our studies on conflict. We didn't begin with it and with the intent of applying it. It arose organically, especially from the case studies and the literature review. But it's a mechanism by which we can take a very complex process that before maybe seemed rather chaotic and study it systematically and show that it is not chaotic. It actually has logic and predictability. And so it provides a framework in which to look at this complex process and also to do comparative analysis from one country to another, or one location to another, or one case study to another. But the other thing, in sort of stepping back and looking at it more broadly, most studies prior to this focused on the company-community interface, where conflict outbreak manifests normally, and focused on that interface to try and determine why the players were behaving the way they were and what was causing that conflict. But by focusing on that, all you're focusing on is an outcome. a final outcome of a long-term process. And to really understand what's going on, you have to look back and look at the pathway that led to that outcome. It's something like a disease process. If you go into a doctor with symptoms, your hope is that the doctor is not going to just look at the symptoms. In order to understand how to treat you, the doctor is going to have to understand what's going on underneath those symptoms. And if it's a disease, the disease process and the pathway it's taken to arrive where it's at. So then they can apply the right kind of intervention to effectively address it. So similarly, when we are looking at conflict, unless we have that knowledge of that pathway, we're not going to be able to decide on the proper interventions to really address it and target the things we need to target effectively.
I'd like to follow up on that, maybe using your analogy some. We've seen in a number of cases that there's a tension between acting quickly, intervening quickly, and then taking time to properly understand the situation. And I think this question is getting at, how do you manage this tension? How do you think about this tension? And so in the medical analog, it would be, how many tests do you run? How long do you wait before you treat a patient in the emergency room, as opposed to preventive care and things where there's a lot more time?
That's a very interesting question. And well, we've come to the conclusion that, well, let me just step back a little bit. For the last 15 or 20 years, the focus has been on industry practice, industry approach, ethical and social practice, and trying to enable industry to improve practices in order to prevent conflict. And to us now, that focus of attention was appropriate from a certain point of view, but it can only get us part of the way to the objective, which is sustainable mineral development. The real key is the quality of governance applied by the host country government. Basically, the type of government that is applied by the host government determines, to a large extent, whether or not you're going to have sustainable development or sustained conflict. And we have to acknowledge that 20, 30 years ago, when many governments started on this complex journey of mineral development, they didn't have the means to approach it in a strategic way with realistically thinking that they're going to reach sustainable development. Maybe 30 years ago, we didn't even really know what sustainable development was. Well, we do now. And host governments are capable now of doing this, of approaching it that way. So even when companies are responsible for making or creating conflicts through mistakes or sometimes irresponsible behavior, if the government has been successful in establishing a proper governance regime, that will mitigate and even prevent those kinds of situations caused by companies. Because what I mean by a strategic approach to governing mineral development, for instance, includes preparing rural communities for the arrival of a large-scale mining sector before it arrives. It includes the government having a presence in terms of regulatory compliance and social development within those communities. It's that absence of that presence and that absence of regulatory monitoring and control that allows companies that makes mistakes or that are involved in irresponsible practices to cause conflict. So proper governance will be an effective way of preventing conflict caused by companies. Just one more point, though.
Yes.
Our studies really indicate that the conflict that we've observed recently, and since about 2002, that has shown almost an exponential rise in conflict incidents around the world, we would attribute primarily, not entirely, but primarily to the governance problems generated by host governments over the past 20 or 30 years.
Get to that last point that you just made. There's this question of companies and governments/governance. And there was I had a very interesting discussion with a colleague who is working in a country, and the company, from experience, this is a mining company, knew that they needed to consult with the communities, knew that they needed to build that relationship. And so they wanted to take a year to do that and to have a series of discussions and get a common vision, understand where the community is coming from, communicate where they're coming from. And the government said, talk all you want, but you have to start operations in 3 months. We need the revenue.
Well,
how do you deal with that sort of the compulsion or the desire to get those revenues flowing?
Well, I guess again, going back 20 years ago, is probably almost impossible because what it involves is suggesting to the government that they slow down and do it properly. And industry to slow down as well. I mean, industry is just as impatient as government to get in there and start operations and creating profits and creating employment and so on. And governments are just as impatient to get foreign direct investment flowing into their country and starting on that road to development that they want to follow. But the whole problem arises from lack of strategic approaches, which takes time. And also lack of capacity to govern effectively, lack of preparation for the arrival of the large-scale mining sector and all its benefits and impacts. So, you know, if you're going to do that properly, it just takes time. And 20 years ago, that nobody was prepared to do that, and maybe they didn't even see the necessity for it. Now, many of these countries that made those decisions 20 or 30 years ago are suffering and struggling with many problems associated with natural resource development. And I believe many of them now see that they need to take the time and retool, reboot, redirect their mining industries. Although it's going to be much more difficult now to do that, given the momentum that's been established, as opposed to starting on the right foot from the very beginning. So our hope is that the countries that are just starting out on the complex journey of mineral development will make the choices that are necessary to do it successfully.
I'd like to shift to a couple other governance-related questions that came in. One person said that transparency is not a word often associated with companies in the extractive industry. Beyond regulation, what incentives exist, if any, for companies to participate in access to information initiatives? And I might expand that to say, what incentives exist for companies to be transparent, particularly in the extractive industries with respect to conflict prevention, conflict reduction?
Well, there are many different levels of transparency that you can talk about. So if it's transparency, for instance, of a mining operation and the revenues that they have given to host governments, and that's all part of the EITI, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. Well, in those countries that have signed on to the EITI, the companies don't have a choice, and neither do the host governments if they're going to actually follow the EITI. But it certainly is an advantage for companies to make those revenues transparent and available to the public, because if there is corruption in the government, And those revenues that receive, those royalties received from the large-scale mining sector are not being very appropriately or responsibly to benefit the whole population of that country, then the transparency that exists can reveal that. And not only to the general public of that particular country, but also to the outside world to see as well. And that's an incentive for everybody to act more responsibly. One of the biggest problems I think that the large-scale mining sector faces within many developing countries is the dissatisfaction by host societies that after 20 years of mineral development, they're not seeing really any benefits accruing from it. And that's a big issue. And in large part, I think the responsibility rests on the shoulders of the host governments on how they're using those funds and whether they're using them in the most effective way to benefit their societies. So that's on one level. I will just briefly mention another level of transparency that I think the responsibility here rests with the mining companies or the exploration companies. So in Canada and the United States, Australia and other countries, the securities regulatory bodies require public companies to divulge any situation that can have materiality or a material effect on the value of those companies' shares. Okay, so if you're a shareholder of that company, that law, that regulation requires that company to divulge to you, the investor, anything that's going to affect the shares of that company. Well, that includes a problem with the community, because we've all seen that communities, if they feel strongly enough, can effectively shut down an operation or stop your exploration program. And that sure will affect the value of your shares. Well, many companies in the past have avoided communicating to their investing public that they're having problems with the community, because that will depress the value of their shares right there. So that's a big issue. And I suppose many companies, the thought process that goes through their minds is that, oh, well, we'll be able to handle this. Let's not get ahead of ourselves and start communicating this. Let's just give ourselves time to handle it, resolve it, and move on. And there is a judgment decision involved there. But I think more often than not in the past, it has been that information has not been divulged. So that's another aspect of transparency, but it has many layers.
I'd like to shift from the transparency with respect to companies to countries, or I should say, the question is recognizing that transparency and access to information are key elements of good governance. Is there a particular example of an entity, public or private, that innovatively and successfully made access to information a key part of its natural resource management strategy?
I think there are a number of examples of that. The one that immediately comes to mind is an example of a very large construction, a mine construction. And this is a particularly vulnerable time in the mining cycle because the management changes during construction. Normally in the construction of a large facility, they have a very different focus, and it's not always on community development like the previous management had to bring it to that stage. So it's a stage of high risk. And in this one particular example that I'm thinking about, the construction was adjacent to the communities. And the company set up a website But that was very interactive, and it was constantly being the information flow was constantly being upgraded. So any of the citizens in those local communities could log in to that site at any time and keep up to date with news, developments in construction, delays, changes in plans. So I think that was one excellent tool to manage this particular stage of the mining cycle that is significantly risky in terms of conflict.
Tony, I don't want to put anyone in a difficult position, but is it possible to share the URL for that website if people are interested in seeing what that might look like so they could adapt it to their circumstances?
I'd be happy to. It'll take some digging to find it, but I'm sure I can. I'd be happy to do that.
So if you send it to us, we can then post it in the discussion group for people who are interested.
Sure, no problem.
I also, another thing that struck me in this vein of innovations was Liberia's approach to the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, where they were one of the first countries to sign on. And there was concern about particularly diamonds, but also iron ore. But they then extended it in two dimensions. They extended it to other resources, including timber and rubber. And they extended it to include contracts, so that it's not just a question of being transparent about the revenues, but being transparent about what the contracts say. And since then, some of the other EITI countries have done that. And in fact, I believe, maybe you know this better than I, that EITI, the new standards, include requirements or provisions on contract transparency, among other things.
And so, what is your question?
That was more just a follow-on comment, and I didn't know if you were familiar with the new EITI standards that went beyond. The original EITI really deals with money in, money out, money paid, money received, I should say, and then an accounting of the total numbers to make sure that there was no loss or corruption in that initial payment. But EITI has taken it's extended the access to information requirements beyond that, building on a lot of innovative practices of different countries. I didn't know if you want to comment on that.
Sure, and I think that was a natural progression as well. I mean, you have to start, as the EITI did, in a place that's right at the core in terms of, well, what revenues are being shared with government from companies, but now they're extending it into more detailed areas. And, technology allows that to happen without an overburden of administration that goes along with it. Technology allows it to happen relatively easily. However, what I think is equally, if not more important, is what people refer to as beyond transparency. And that is a focus on, okay, so governments are receiving these revenues from the mining industry. What are they doing with it? How are they investing it? How are they expending it to the benefit of society in general? Are the local communities where the mining operations are located receiving a portion of those royalties to help with local development and, in fact, rural development? Because in many of these countries, the developmental process has been basically fragmented. It is focused on kind of the central elite at the expense of the rural parts of countries which have received very little development. So it's very important that once the large-scale mining industry has been established in a country like that, that it's used for rural development. And so beyond transparency, I believe, will help incentivize that kind of responsible use of resources.
You're transitioning to the next question beautifully. Somebody was asking about how can marginalized groups or local communities equitably benefit from natural resources. The extractive industry usually relies on large exogenous companies to monetize resources due to economies of scale, technology, and funding. But artisanal mining also seems to be harmful because of the lack of regulation. And so one question is, how can marginalized groups benefit? And the other is, does EITI push for benefits to be shared with local people when it has civil society engaged?
Okay, yeah, well, it kind of is a natural segue, what I was just talking about, into that question. The whole area of how local communities benefit from mining operations is a very large one. It looms large in our studies of the conflict process because asymmetrical benefits or lack of benefits is a big conflict driver. So, for instance, when you're looking at the conflict pathway analytical framework, it's a very important conflict determinant at the level of conflict drivers. And there are a number of different aspects of this. So local communities should receive the benefits of local mining through employment. I mean, that's the first natural sort of expectation that a community would have. It should also receive benefits from the community development programs of the company that help to build social infrastructure and programs. It should also benefit from, as I was saying just a minute ago, a portion of the royalties that company or companies pay to the central government. That often does not happen. Even if it's law made by the central government, oftentimes those funds do not make their way back to the local authorities and the local communities. And there's probably a whole bunch of different reasons for that. So I think all of these issues contribute to conflict, as we have tried to demonstrate in our studies. But also, in terms of benefit, another aspect of this which is crucially important in this mining is the presence of government in those rural mining districts. And in the cases that we've looked at, it seems to be the practice of central governments to grant concessions to the large-scale mining industry and then basically walk away. So the mining company is left to negotiate land acquisition, compensation, and the general relationship with the community without government presence. And the government presence is absolutely crucial because otherwise what you have is a company-centric system where the community gradually becomes more and more dependent on the company. It knows that it can't depend on the central government, and eventually has unrealistic expectations of that company because the company is basically then acting as a proxy for government. And no company can do that. No CSR or community development program is designed to replace the role of government. If government is there and has a presence and is contributing to social development programs, making sure that the revenues that arrive to local government are expended in a responsible way for the benefit of local communities, then it can work.
One of the students asked a somewhat related question about what level of responsibility do private entities have to help ensure that benefits from extractive projects are fairly distributed. I think this ties in nicely to what you were talking about, this the risk of companies intruding into areas where government should be acting but isn't necessarily acting, or isn't necessarily acting in the right way. But this question of responsibility to ensure that benefits are fairly distributed, not just paying to the government and then leaving it up to the government.
Well, in a way, companies in this situation find themselves between a rock and a hard place when they are paying royalties to the central government. I mean, in one of the case studies we looked at, that the central government had promulgated a law and a very detailed formula as to how those royalties were to be distributed, right down to the local authorities of those communities. But it wasn't happening. So what the companies find themselves in like I said, between a rock and a hard place, because on the one hand, they're being allowed to operate by the regulatory body, which is the government. On the other hand, is it realistic to expect them to put pressure on the government to follow its own laws and make sure that the local communities are receiving the funds that they should? So most companies will probably not want to rock the boat unnecessarily, and they will try and compensate by the local programs that they themselves deliver to those communities. Of course, if that's the route they follow, that they're just promoting that vicious circle of the community becoming more and more dependent on the company and that company-centric system.
I'd like to shift to a couple of questions that deal with some of the practical aspects here and your experience. The first question is, how have you in your work approached the challenge of making sure that different stakeholders are well represented and actually have the capacity to engage in a meaningful way in mediation, or more broadly in the process?
Well, that's a very good question. And I guess what I would focus on is dialogue. And actually, dialogue seems to be a fairly recent phenomenon in terms of the focus it's received and the recognition that dialogue is the place to begin when you have high conflict risk. Well, in fact, it's a place to begin before you even open the doors to foreign direct investment in the large-scale mining industry. And the dialogue that I'm talking about there is what we term in our paper institutionalized engagement. So government engaging the communities which are located in the areas of high mineral potential. So the government engages in dialogue with those communities, basically letting them know what they're going to be doing in terms of inviting in foreign direct investment and preparing them for that, and also asking them if that's what they want, and that's the application of free, prior, and informed consent. So that's where the dialogue has to begin. But when you have a situation with an established mining operation in local communities, and there is a potential for conflict, or there is tensions rising, dialogue is, again, where you have to begin to resolve that problem, where people are sitting around the table with all the diverse interests and being able to work things out in a participatory process. That's the way it should be.
How does this work in very hierarchical societies where there may be deference to age or status or something like that, and there isn't necessarily as strong a tradition of dialogue as much as enunciation?
Well, it's a difficult process, especially in authoritarian governments, where, as you point out, dialogue is not necessarily a common phenomenon. Um, and I suppose, you know, in countries that are ruled by authoritarian governments, um, I suppose law and order can be maintained through that authority. But the problem is that it's done oftentimes by force, by coercion, and companies working in those kinds of environments. Um, some companies are quite happy to work in those environments because there's a certain level of security. Um, Whereas in democracies, you know, there are human rights considerations. Everybody has their say. It's more complex in some cases. But, you know, it's again, we're talking about the companies who end up in those particular types of environments, I think have to ask themselves, um, are we doing the right thing here? Is our presence and activity over time benefiting society? And if it's not, then they're subject to criticism and basically taking advantage of a situation like that. But yes, dialogue is a tough thing in an authoritarian government regime.
I was wondering if, while we're on this question of dialogue, if you could also speak to some of the gender aspects. How do you get the appropriate gender, especially women, in the room and or in the dialogue, and then how do you encourage them, or how do you facilitate their voice being heard?
Well, everything else being equal, which what I'm referring to there, depending on what kind of society you're trying to operate in, it's up if it's the company that really wants this dialogue to happen, um, then they have to insist on it. So, I mean, first of all, they have to do a stakeholder mapping process, which is now a standard part of the procedure with social professionals, field professionals, many of whom work for companies, to identify who is out there and what is their connection with the project. Whether how are they going to benefit, or how they're going to be impacted by the project, and in any dialogue process to ensure that they are invited to the table and they are given the opportunity to express their concerns and needs, and not to have it any other way. It's easy to say. It's sometimes very complex to achieve, but I don't think there's any other way.
Shifting gears a little, we just had a question come in. I'll read it first. Why don't companies take out all as fast as necessary and store in their countries instead of destroying the site for 40 to 60 years? I think the student might be referring to why mining at a particular site can take decades, but I'm not exactly certain. Do you have thoughts on this?
Well, mining is essentially a massive movement of material. That's what it involves. A massive movement of material from underground to the surface, where it can be treated and concentrated, and then shipping that material to market or to smelters, where it can be processed into metal. So if the individual is asking, well, why does it have to be stored on the surface at the site and therefore have a bigger footprint at the site in those developing countries? Unfortunately, that is the nature of mining, and there's no other way to do it. So, But it does depend to a certain extent on the commodity being mined. So if it's diamonds, for instance, they can have a relatively small footprint in terms of the facilities on the surface that are required. Gold is another one that, and I'm emphasizing relative here, the relative impact. And it also depends on where the processing facilities are and the smelters and so on, because they take up a significant area of the surface facility and also contribute to environmental impact potentially as well. So the smallest footprint could be an underground mine that ships concentrate offshore to a processing facility and smelter. However, there's a downside to everything, right? If they do that, that country will not benefit from the processing and the smelting of the ore into metal, and therefore, and then the trading of that metal on the international marketplace.
You were talking about different techniques. I saw in Sierra Leone there was where they had a bauxite mine. That sometimes this is just a big open mine, and then you have to fill it all back in. But what they did was very interesting. They essentially had like a long strip that they mined, and when they were done with it, and they put the waste, dirt, rocks up there, and I think that stayed there for a while. But then they did the next strip, and they put that into the mined strip. Then they did the next strip and put that into the second strip. So they essentially backfilled as they went. So you didn't have that huge environmental impact for a long time, but you were able to start restoring the site a lot earlier. And this also addressed one of the problems in many mines, which is remediation after the mine is done, that there often isn't enough money to do the remediation. So at least here they're doing remediation as they go. I don't know if you've seen that done elsewhere.
Absolutely, I have, yes, especially with bulk mining, which has potentially the largest impact. So bulk mining would include iron ore, it would include coal. I have seen, for instance, coal mines in Canada that do exactly that. They rehabilitate as they're mining. And most of these bulk mining operations are open pit mines. And so they are able to do that and recreate habitat while they're rehabilitating as well. In fact, in northern Alberta, where I was looking at one particular coal mining operation, they had mountain goats, and they were rehabilitating the pits that they had finished with, but only to a point, because leaving the cliffs in those pits actually generated new habitat for mountain goats. And as the mountain goat population increased, so did the predators. So they had a whole ecosystem that was equal, if not more, than the natural habitat that they had begun. That was there before they began.
This is a good transition. We've talked a lot about the economic side of things, payments of revenues, benefit sharing, those dimensions. But another source of conflict and grievance is often around the environmental and social impacts. And wondering if there are particular approaches that you have used in identifying those impacts early on, or in trying to address them as the tensions have arisen.
Well, that's a really interesting question again, because when quite a number of years ago, when we were working primarily with companies, we would be impressing on the companies that before they set foot on the ground to start doing exploration, they should be engaging the communities and talking to them about their plans, and gradually expanding the engagement into participatory participatory decision-making, and so on. Well, now I will tell you that the way to approach this is through proper governance and management of mineral development by the host government. If the first thing that local communities do is a company surveying the ground in preparation to do exploration and eventually construct a mine, they already feel that something's wrong here. The government didn't talk to them. They are not prepared for this. There's a huge power differential, and so on and so forth. If the government had come in, prepared them for the arrival of the large-scale mining sector, was there to balance out the power differential and to participate in those discussions that were going to go forward, that is the most effective way of approaching this. Not just a dependency on companies again to go into rural areas and act on their own. But it's interesting because we've gone through an evolution here as well, as we've gradually increased our understanding of the whole conflict process, which is the other side of the coin to responsible, sustainable development. So in studying conflict, and the whole conflict process has led us to have a better understanding of the way mineral development should be approached in the first place.
This raises a question. Somebody asked, have you been involved in the conflict assessment? And if so, can you talk a bit about that process and what, if anything, was surprising to you about the experience?
Well, we have certainly been involved in risk assessment and due diligence for individual companies and their properties. With respect to the conflict study on a much broader frame of looking at a whole country, we've applied that to 5 case studies. 4 of them were specific case studies involving conflict between mining companies and communities, and 1 was a case study, a country case study conducted in Ghana. But we hope that the next phase of our work will be evolving the conflict pathway analytical framework from a research tool to a practical tool for assessing exactly that. In other words, is a country on a pathway that is sustainable development or sustained conflict, you know, or a country is in a particular place right now, which is not very good. What are the specific areas that are causing the problem, and how can we address those? So the conflict pathway analytical framework has a potential for governments to, first of all, map out the process that's happening now, pinpoint the areas that they need to focus on to redirect that. And for companies, it has the potential for a practical application of due diligence and risk assessment for companies before they actually enter a new country to start investing in mineral development. So if they look at the whole governance process using the analytical framework, they will get a much better understanding of where conflict risk is concentrated, and therefore what they need to do in order to reduce that.
I have 2 last questions. First one's a little on the long side. The south of Lebanon has everyone's attention now that the oil and gas sector is starting to emerge. There are currently unsolved maritime disputes with Israel on the southern maritime borders, mainly due to the potential existence of rich oil and gas resources. And so they were asking, do you think in that case the resource itself can be used as a tool for solving maritime disputes besides the existing diplomatic disputes? Moreover, Hezbollah, which possesses its own militia, says its own illegitimate militia, I'm just reading the question here, is a major player in this conflict, even though it doesn't represent the Lebanese government itself. Um, so the question is, how do you manage in this situation where there are powerful non-state actors that may be operating instead or in lieu of the government, instead of the government, which may have other incentives and other beliefs about where the line should be drawn? And then to what extent do you believe mediation and negotiation should be um, done in this context? And should an organization like Hezbollah be involved in that mediation?
Wow.
Yes, heck of a way to end the day.
Well, it would be an interesting debate if we had a few more hours, actually. But first of all, I have to admit I'm not familiar in detail with that region of the world and the geopolitics of that region, no more than anybody else who listens to the news. I've never worked in that specific area. So I'll answer the question more generically. I think one of the questions that I heard was, can negotiation around mineral resources be a catalyst for peace building?
Yes.
Among countries? And well, in the past, it's been a catalyst for war. When there's been a shortage of resources that are much needed, and there's a competition for who owns those particular resources. And invasion has often been, in the past, a solution to that. But I think that within a country, the identification of mineral resources as a means for economic development, it has been shown that it can be a catalyst for bringing the various elements of society in that country together to talk about economic development of the country in more general terms. And in particular, that resource development is just a very good initial stage of development. You build a platform through resource development on which you can then start diversifying the economy and building a stronger economy that way, and entering into the global trade environment. It's a pathway, and it all depends on so many factors as to whether this is successful. But having the right process and political will are crucial in that area. But yeah, I think it can be a catalyst. In terms of where it's more of a geopolitical situation involving a number of countries, I think I will just focus on saying that political will really comes into this in a strong way. And one of the things that we still have to look at in our studies on conflict are politics and politicians. So, and that's a significant factor. But what a country is prepared to do, it often boils down to the political will of the governing party. So in a situation involving a number of countries, if they make progress, it really depends on the political will of the governments of those countries at the time.
I think the other question that they were asking was, you may have the interstate negotiations, in this case between Israel and Lebanon. Then you have another powerful non-state actor that has a militia that whose legitimacy may be contested. And how do you deal with or ignore that third party?
Well, what comes to my mind right away, and to get it sort of back to mining, is there's some commonalities between the whole question of artisanal mining and the fact that you can have legal artisanal mining, so it's licensed, You can have informal, unlicensed artisanal mining, and you can have illegal artisanal mining. So again, in the case of Ghana, you have all three. So the Ghanaian government regulated artisanal mining for Ghanaians. So only Ghanaians can benefit can conduct and benefit from small scale and artisanal mining. So the situation now, in the current situation, is that you have licensed Ghanaians conducting artisanal mining. You have Ghanaians who are not licensed conducting artisanal mining, and you have people from other countries, especially China, who are there illegally and illegally conducting artisanal mining. And when you look at, okay, so what do you do about that situation where it's totally unregulated? The first thing you have to do is you have to deal with the illegal mining. That is step number one. And you have to do it through legal approaches and formalization as well. So for those that you can persuade to do things in a licensed legal way, you follow that route. For those who are in the country illegally, you remove them from the country. So going back to the example of Hezbollah and multiple countries trying to negotiate with the elephant in the room, being Hezbollah, you have to deal with that. And you have to deal with it, I suppose, using a number of different strategies, some of which are legal and some of which lie in the field of negotiation and diplomacy. I mean, if you take the Ireland as an example, the Irish Republican Army was transformed into a political party at the end of the day. So there's many different ways of approaching this through the method of formalization, as opposed to opposition and conflict.
Excellent. Well, I maybe give you a quick question to close here. We're running up against the time, but wondering if you might share one of the projects or initiatives that you're most proud of, or an experience, a project that was particularly challenging that you learned the most from. Maybe we could close out on that note.
Sure. Well, thanks for that question. And then the one that immediately comes to mind is, well, it refers back to a question you had a few minutes ago. Have we ever done a due diligence and risk assessment? And I said, yes, we have done for companies and also for financial institutions. And the one that I was particularly satisfied with, a global banking institution approached us and told us that they were about to provide a large debt facility to a mining company who wanted to finish the construction of a mine, but they had a real conflict in the region. A number of people had been killed, not by the company, but because of the conflict in the region. There had been kidnappings. Properties have been burned down. It was not a good situation. So the bank wanted to know basically whether they should provide that debt facility and what the risks were in providing it. So in our risk assessment that we did, we also provided information about what we felt the company could do to mitigate some of the most significant risks. And the bank turned around and said to the company, you'll get your debt facility if you address all of these things that you should be doing and aren't, that will decrease risk. The companies turned around and hired a very excellent organization to help them develop a proper corporate social responsibility program. And that, in fact, led to a decrease in a lot of the risks associated with that project. And it just illustrated to me how powerful the financial sector can be in raising the standards of companies. And yet, they don't see that as a primary role. But the potential is certainly there, and I hope that develops as well. So that was one of the most instructive things for me.
Well, thank you so much, Tony. Delighted to have you sharing your experiences and your insights, and really appreciate your time with us. Hope others will be able to join us for the next office hour. And thank you very much, Tony. Take care, everyone.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I enjoyed it.